All right. Good morning, everyone. Welcome. Thank you all for being here today, and welcome to those of you who are joining us by way of Zoom this morning. I will invite folks to make your way to a seat. Please feel free to get coffee. There's muffins over there, so please help yourself. We have a full hour ahead of us, and I want to start by saying Happy New Year to each of you. I hope that you enjoyed time with loved ones, maybe a bit of rest in some form or fashion. The new year brings with it a shift here at Covenant. As a church, we are exploring what it looks like and means to be all in with heart, with soul, with mind, and with strength. And today, on Convocation Sunday, we begin our focus on mind. What does it look like to be all in with our minds? What might we need to wrap our minds around in order to better be all in as it relates to our lives of faith? Today, we are so fortunate to have the Reverend Dr. Elizabeth Hinson-Hasty here to help us wrap our minds around reproductive ethics, a topic over which there are many questions, perhaps even some concerns. Dr. Hinson-Hasty will help us explore this topic within the larger context of the U.S. culture wars and will help lead us to a place of informed understanding and faithful perspective. The Reverend Dr. Elizabeth Hinson-Hasty is a professor of theology and ethics at Union Presbyterian Seminary. Several of her students are members of Covenant. She's also a minister member of the Charlotte Presbytery. Elizabeth's research explores themes such as Christian economic ethics, women and the social gospel, and religious freedom, among other themes. The title of her latest book is Authentic Christian Freedom: Deconstructing the American Gospel of Liberty. I anticipate that the hour before us will be rich with information and imagine that questions will arise during that time. We will have time for those questions at the end of Dr. Hinson-Hasty's presentation, so I encourage you to write those down on the pieces of paper that are scattered about the room, and we will collect those for a time of question and response later on. Before turning things over to our guest, would you please join me in a word of prayer? Gracious God, so often we jump to conclusions about people and policies before having much information. We thank you today for an opportunity to gather information in a trusted place among trusted community. We thank you for the wisdom in this room and pray that you would help us to each approach the hour ahead with a sense of appreciative inquiry, and that we'd each receive what this hour holds with patience and grace, so that we might approach all that comes our way with a steady faith and dedicated discipleship. Through Christ we pray. Amen. Would you please join me in welcoming Dr. Elizabeth Hinson-Hasty?
Thanks so much, Mary Kate, and thank you so much for a warm welcome here this morning and the opportunity to visit with you here at Covenant Presbyterian Church. I had a chance last year to take a tour of this campus, and it is just quite an impressive facility, and I know the ministry you're doing is very valuable, so I appreciate the opportunity. I wanted to begin our discussion this morning and really invite you into a conversation about reproductive ethics, the impact of changes of abortion policy, and also justice for women by centering ourselves with a reading from biblical text. It's from the book of Exodus, which in Hebrew is really the book of names. And it's a story of women's resistance and the story of women who are provisioning for life. So let's take a minute to center ourselves with a reading from Exodus 1:15-22. Then the king of Egypt said to the Hebrew midwives, whose names were Shiphrah and Puah, when you're helping the Hebrew women during childbirth on the delivery stool, if you see the baby is a boy, kill him. But if it is a girl, let her live. The midwives, however, feared God, and did not do what the king of Egypt told them to do. They let the boys live. Then the king of Egypt summoned the midwives and asked them, "Why have you done this? Why have you let the boys live?" The midwives answered Pharaoh, "Hebrew women are not like Egyptian women. They are vigorous and give birth before the midwives arrive." So God was kind to the midwives, and the people increased and became even more numerous. And because the midwives feared God, he gave them families of their own. Then the Pharaoh gave the order, "Every Hebrew boy that is born, you must throw into the Nile, but the girls shall live." I wanted to center our conversation in this story because of the importance of midwives among communities and the relationship of their experiences also to this abortion debate in the 21st century. I also want to invite you to begin with a rhetorical question and to reflect for a moment on your earliest memory of the abortion debate. I know you have some cards there if you want to jot it down. And the image you see here is from one of my earliest memories of the abortion debate. I want to mention to you that I grew up actually in the Southern Baptist tradition. And as part of that, also frequented Southern Baptist convention meetings. In the 1970s, after Roe v. Wade was passed, you were often invited into the convention by people who were handing out cards with images of aborted fetuses. There was a kind of fear that people felt as they entered into that debate among the religious community. And it's always helped to shape, in many ways, the way I've entered into dialogue or reflected on dialogue about abortion policy. At the same time, I want to emphasize here that the lawyer, her name was Linda Coffey, who argued Roe v. Wade, she was also a Baptist. And she said about the decision that it advanced the cause of religious liberty, human equality, and justice. And her own framing of her arguments with regard to Roe v. Wade also emphasized the importance that the debate should distinguish between the legal and the personal. Here, what you see in this image is a 1973 gathering after the Supreme Court decision, an important kind of memory that I think still impacts us today. As I mentioned in my summary of what I wanted to discuss this morning, I also wanted to relate abortion policy to the culture war. So let's think for a minute about what a culture war is and how we're seeing that conflict play out with a particular policy, but also with other debates in our society about religious freedom, also about even prayer in public schools, parental rights with regard to school choice. All of these kinds of issues are interconnected as we begin to think about reproductive justice. A culture war is a cultural conflict between differing social groups and the struggle for dominance of their moral vision, values, beliefs, and policies. A sociologist named James Davidson Hunter popularized this idea in the late 1980s when two phenomena he observed piqued his curiosity. First, he wanted to understand whether or not social, moral, and political issues that seemed on the surface to be disconnected were actually tied together in some way. For example, at the time, there were widespread demonstrations for and against banning smoking in public places, reproductive rights, demonstrations for and against advocacy for gay rights, and protests against the dangers posed by nuclear power. All of these movements employed similar strategies and patterns of engagement. Rather than focusing on the distinctive nature of these debates and movements, Hunter concluded from his research that US American public culture was undergoing significant realignment, that in turn was generating significant tension and conflict. These antagonisms were playing out on the public stage and with regard to public policy. They were also playing out on the deepest and most profound levels of ideology in the use of public symbols, myths about US American culture, popular debate, and also political discourse. Underneath the social struggle, he found a much deeper crisis over the meaning and the purpose of core institutions of US American society and the relationship between ideas of individual liberty, collective responsibility, and visions of the good life. Part of the focus of my most recent work is on competing views of freedom, personal and religious, in the United States, and how those competing views are at the heart of the US culture wars and also debates about reproductive ethics. One of the images that you see on the screen, it's not very easily read perhaps from where you're sitting, but it comes from the New York Times where they're highlighting 10 of the most popular and important kinds of statistics to pay attention to this year with regard to the move to the right in US culture, not just in the United States, but also in the larger global community. And I'm happy for the church to keep this PowerPoint so that you can click on the links and also find these statistics. The last election showed significant movement to the right. And this is happening not only in the US, but around the world, where conservative notions of freedom are informed by capitalist, racialized, gendered, and ableist social hierarchies, as well as patriarchal assumptions about women, notions of the good family, and also choices women may have with regard to pregnancy, childbearing, and mothering. This is a kind of critical moment for us in the US. And I want to reflect on some general facts, but also think about some of the themes that are highlighted by Planned Parenthood in terms of restrictions on abortion and past abortion policy. Planned Parenthood points out that these days, restrictions on abortion are being passed so often that it can be easy to forget that abortion has been legal much of the time in the United States. Leaders did not outlaw abortion until the mid 1800s in our nation. From colonial days until those first laws, abortion was a regular part of life for women. Common law allowed abortion prior to what was known as quickening, which is an archaic term for fetal movement that usually happened after around 4 months of pregnancy. Medical literature and newspapers in the late 1700s and early 1800s regularly referred to herbs and medications as abortion-inducing methods, since surgical procedures at the time were rare. Reproductive care, including abortion, was unregulated in those days, and it was provided by skilled midwives, nurses, and other unlicensed women's healthcare providers. Midwives were trusted, legitimate medical professionals who provided essential reproductive care in the US. Prior to the Civil War, white men were generally not involved in the kind of gynecological or obstetric care practices that we know today. Half of the women who provided reproductive care were Black women, some of whom were enslaved Black women. Midwives also included Indigenous and white men. According to an essay that was written by Michelle Goodwin, who's a law professor at University of California, Irvine, restrictions on abortion were introduced with the medical model of pregnancy care. So starting around the time of Civil War, a coalition of white doctors with support from the Catholic Church and others also wanted to control women's bodies, and it led to a movement to push state governments to outlaw abortion across the board. Planned Parenthood also emphasizes that the male-dominated medical profession wanted to take authority from the female-dominated profession of midwives, including the authority to provide abortion. By 1910, abortion was banned nationwide. Now, I want to underscore that date, 1910, particularly when I emphasize this conversation in light of a larger culture war. 1910 is near the time that there was an important document that was published called the Fundamentals of Christianity. So, it's the introduction of a movement of fundamentalist Christian that also later and today has become allied with the Roman Catholic Church and a kind of emphasis on natural law that should bar or prevent abortion and other kinds of reproductive justice considerations for women within our nation. Now, some additional facts, and you can see these on the screen, but I know they're a bit difficult to read, so I want to highlight those here. In the United States, 1 in 4 women will have an abortion by the age of 45. Now, that's a really important statistic because that means 25% of women in our nation will need to have access to this particular medical procedure. Roe versus Wade legalized the federal constitutional right to abortion in 1973, which remained a law in the United States for nearly 50 years. Roe versus Wade also did not guarantee access. Since 1976, the Hyde Amendment blocked federal Medicaid funding for abortion services. So there's always been serious inequities with regard to abortion care. As of now, 1 in 3 women in the United States live in states where abortion is not accessible. 18 states banned or severely restricted abortion since Roe versus Wade was overturned. There are also some new and very unpredictable implications with regard to these policy changes in the 21st century. And I want to draw upon some comments here made by a Christian social ethicist. Her name is Kate Ott. She teaches at Garrett Evangelical School of Theology. And she emphasizes that there are stories that are now being told by a variety of obstetricians and gynecologists who are speaking out about concerns of at-risk and high-risk pregnancy patients when all or most abortions are restricted. For example, one high-risk pregnancy patient in Texas had to travel to Denver for an abortion following a diagnosis at 19 weeks of preterm premature rupture of membranes, which can cause infection or death in a patient. She also observes that there are new and unpredictable dimensions to these policy changes in the digital age. Doctors now report being restricted from providing a range of medical information and advice in causes like this or after a miscarriage because they could be digitally recorded. Some states put pregnant people at risk for routine reproductive health issues, including those that may create life-threatening conditions on a patient's or a partner's phone who accuses them of aiding and abetting in an abortion. This is particularly true in states such as Texas, which has one of the laws known as the Heartbeat Act. One of the things that Kate Ott emphasizes with regard to the digital age is that this is also of concern, particularly for people who are involved in other caregiving activities. For example, a chaplain or a pastor who may provide counsel to someone who would be considering an abortion. So it might not only be a physician who is recorded, a colleague, a friend, a clergy member helping a pregnant person cross a state line will likely have their license photographed via routine traffic cameras, or perhaps their conversations could be recorded and shared with others and also put them at risk. This could include additionally in a telehealth call or in other contexts that may need to be considered. So can also more directly some of this conversation to the culture war that I mentioned, and specifically policies related to abortion and reproductive ethics. Health equity scholars argue that the Supreme Court decision to overturn Roe versus Wade and the growing onslaught of state laws that criminalize abortion are part of a long history of maintaining white supremacy through reproductive control of Black and socially marginalized lives. Michelle Goodwin, the professor that I mentioned earlier, ties anti-abortion policies directly to white supremacy. And she argues that prior to the Civil War, abortion and contraceptives were legal in the US and used by Indigenous women as well as those who sailed to these lands from Europe. For the most part, the persons who performed all manner of reproductive health care were women, female midwives. Midwifery was interracial. Half of the women who provided reproductive health care were Black women. Other midwives were Indigenous and white. It wasn't until the wake of slavery's end that skilled Black midwives represented both real competition for white men who sought to enter into the practice of child delivery and also became a threat to obstetricians themselves. Some doctors considered midwives as a relic of the past and an obstacle to scientific progress. What this scholar has done is reviewed newspaper reports with regard to doctors and how they contributed to changing the laws with regard to abortion care. Abortion criminalization also aligns with undercurrents of structural racism through both whom it disproportionately impacts and how power is wielded to erase, suppress, and threaten the livelihoods of racially minoritized communities. There were a record-breaking 108 state laws that were enacted in 2021 that criminalized abortion in the United States, including gestational age bans, restrictions on medicated abortion, trigger bans that automatically banned abortion when Roe was overturned, and Texas-style bans, as I mentioned before, that rely on bounty hunter enforcement mechanisms. This follows decades of laws such as the Hyde Amendment that prohibit federal funds from covering abortion services and undermining abortion rights and access for pregnant people in federally funded programs, including 7.8 million people on Medicaid, half of whom are people of color. Feminist social ethicists such as Kate Ott, Beverly Harrison, and Rebecca Todd Peters assert that what is really at issue in this debate is the massive mobilization of the abortion controversy to advance a particularly restrictive, conservative moral vision of US American society and of the family, I would add. Now, there are some other observations that I could make here, but I want to try to emphasize how churches can respond to these circumstances, and also how we might work together to focus on creating an alternative moral vision and embodying that within our contemporary society. I mentioned earlier that evangelicals and Roman Catholic churches have a powerful alliance with regard to abortion policy. And I also want to add a footnote there because among Catholics, if you look at some of the Catholics for Choice, the majority of people in the pew are actually pro-choice. It is, when I mention Roman Catholic policy, it's an emphasis on the official church policy, which is also a debate for ethicists. And we can have that conversation if you're interested in some of that. So, what can we do, particularly as a Presbyterian church? And what you see on this slide here, you'll notice in the center of the screen, a pastor who's wearing a pink stole there. This is Rebecca Todd Peters. She's a professor at Elon University. She's been on the forefront of abortion dialogue and also written a wonderful book. It's on the next screen. It's called Trust Women. And she's worked with an organization and helped to found this organization. It's called Sacred, which is a national alliance of multiracial, multi-ethnic, multi-faith, mixed gender and sexual identity persons, religious leaders, congregations, movement organizations, activists, academics, and directly impacted communities who are collaborating to advance reproductive justice. If you visit their website, you can sign on to statements. You can also display a sign emphasizing the importance of framing this conversation, and particularly a religious reflection of a kind of pro-choice identity, that actually religious teachings aren't anti-abortion. One of the things I also mentioned in terms of Presbyterian policy, that Presbyterian policy is a friend. Presbyterian churches can teach and promote our specific policy with regard to abortion care. The General Assembly of the Presbyterian Church USA declared in 1970 that abortion is a matter of careful ethical decision by each person and should not be restricted by law. You can find that policy on the PCUSA website. And I'll also mention that we have longtime advocacy groups, advocacy for racial, ethnic, and women's concerns, that has been also at the forefront of dialogue and working with the Office of Public Witness in Washington, D.C., to help to challenge these changes in U.S. law, but also speak a voice related to reproductive justice from the perspective of Christian community, and to be very intentional about that. On this next slide, I want to recommend some readings, and also to recommend the way in which these particular Christian social ethicists begin to frame the conversation about reproductive justice. When we think about reproductive justice and reproductive ethics, it's much more than a political issue. And it's much more also than a conversation about the impact of recent changes in abortion policy. Reproductive ethics is a broad field that covers all moral questions related to medicalization of human reproduction. And you see here a variety of texts. The first one I mentioned to you earlier, it's called Trust Women. And part of Rebecca Todd Peters' argument here is that the way in which our society has framed the debate over abortion policy has led to what she calls a justification paradigm for women. So in other words, rather than women focusing in on their own kind of healthcare and reproductive medical care needs, and thinking about abortion care and access to abortion, our society has framed the debate so women have to begin from the perspective of justifying whether or not they ought to have the right to make that choice. For Peters and for other Christian social ethicists, such as Kate Ott and Grace Cow, who also you see their books on this screen, this is a problematic framing of the debate, because this is a question of also whether or not we might trust women to be able to make decisions for themselves about their own medical needs and their own kind of understanding of what that means with regard to care for the family, when they're ready to have a family, and also the conditions that our society ought to create for families to be able to flourish. I framed I wanted to summarize this maybe in a little bit different way than Trust Women, but raise the question of what would women do, and why would they raise questions about their access to reproductive care. One of the reasons I began my comments this morning with this story from Exodus, where women midwives are involved in life provisioning activities. They're carefully discerning whether or not to follow someone else's orders, and they're thinking about how to provision and care for and support life. The other texts that you see here are equally significant in a larger conversation about how churches might respond. The second book you see on the screen with the green cover is written by Grace Cow. And she's looking at surrogacy and the importance of that in the United States. And it's a wonderful text because she actually chose to be a surrogate parent for a friend. And she writes out of her own experience. So I'd strongly encourage you, if you're interested in surrogacy, to read that text. Sex, Tech, and Faith by Kate Ott looks at the digital age and its implications, not only for reproductive ethics, but also in terms of how we talk about sexuality and the impact of that becoming a public debate through social media, as opposed to past framing with regard to only policy or perhaps in other more controlled environments in schools or in congregational settings. What does it mean to have these debates in the new era in which we're living? And the last book you see there or I guess it's the brown cover. It's written by Anna Vegan, a fantastic scholar who was very at the forefront of health inequity issues and deals with these questions of white supremacy and how they relate to reproductive ethics. The final text, Encountering the Sacred, relates to my last point before I entertain some questions. And that is considering another way in which I think churches can respond to the needs of women more specifically. And that is to ritualize women's experiences. So I want to say a little bit about this particular project of Encountering the Sacred. It's a collection of essays that were written by women, women who have questions about how to raise their children in a very consumerist society. Women who have questions about the experience of miscarriage and how one deals with the sense of loss and grief over that when there's no way to publicly ritualize that. Women who have questions about whether or not they want to become parents, and they're writing out of their own experiences and considering how they encountered God in the midst of those experiences, and then what it might look like to ritualize that in Christian community. So, one of the things I want to suggest in terms of the vibrancy of churches like Covenant Presbyterian Church, this idea of ritualizing women's life events like abortion or miscarriage, or even other events that in some ways have seemed like a disruption to what has been the historic notion of good families and women's role in society, to allow women to claim that space for themselves. What you see on this particular slide, it's an image, it's called Mizuko Kuyo, which literally means Water Child Memorial Service. It's a Buddhist ritual, and you see it appear now in practice in Japan and Thailand and other countries as a way of memorializing abortion or also the loss of a child through miscarriage. And there are some women in the United States that have also begun to ritualize their own experience in this way. I see this in other ways. For example, with women who also wanted to celebrate the birth of a child. In a congregation that we have participated in Louisville, Kentucky, Covenant Community Church, when women gave birth to a child, they would do henna tattoos on their stomachs before they actually went into labor as a way of blessing the woman as she entered into that significant life event. So it's a creative expression of celebrating also that gift of life and being part of that activity. Okay, so I want to welcome questions and see if anything I've said has stimulated thoughts for you or what concerns you have perhaps about how reproductive ethics fits within the larger culture war. So I welcome your questions or comments.
Thank you, Dr. Hinson-Hasty. As you all write down some questions, Robin is going to help me collect those. So Robin, if you'll keep an eye out for folks who have questions, we'll collect those and offer those up. Related to your last point, I do just want to take a brief moment to lift up a support group that we have started here at Covenant called Hannah's Heart. There's information about that group in your announcement sheet that you'll find in worship worship, but this is a group that's open to all women who are navigating infertility. So, related to your last point, it felt relevant to make a comment about that. And if you're interested in learning more about that group or participating, I hope you'll speak to me or reach out to any of the ministers on staff, and we would be just more than happy to connect you to that group. So, with that, if there are questions, we would love to collect those and offer those up. Thank you so much for sharing your wisdom with us this morning. All right, we will keep collecting questions, so feel free to keep writing those down. Our first question is, how might we respond to friends whose anti-abortion views are based in their Christian faith, implying our pro-choice view is anti-Christian?
This is a really important question, and I want to also mention another very helpful book on this. It's called Matters of Life and Death. It was published in the 1990s, mid 1990s, by a scholar. He's a process theologian. His name is John Cobb. And I didn't choose him for this presentation because I wanted to rely on the work of women. There was some intentionality there. We'll say that his argument has been very helpful when we think about the political framing of the abortion debate. And one of the things he suggests is to get the conversation out of the political framing, out of a kind of pro-choice, pro-life paradigm, and to enter into a richer dialogue with regard to questions related to abortion policy. I find that a very helpful way to advance a conversation. And I speak to that after having taught at a Catholic university for 19 years, that actually, if you can remove the discussion from that political framing, you can enter into a much richer dialogue about reproductive justice and invite different questions, and particularly to tell the stories of women and families who have been affected by restrictive abortion policies. You know, allow those stories to enter into the conversation because it gives a totally different grounding, a totally different basis for people to identify with each other on the level of human questions and human experiences. The other thing John Cobb takes up in that that particular book, and it was really early on in framing the pro-choice and pro-life debate, is the question of the beginning of life. That is often the question of those who are anti-choice or who are pro-life. You know, they'll really emphasize how do we determine when life begins? And, you know, he really emphasizes it's not just a question of beginning of life, it's a question of quality of life. And not just quality of life, but what are the circumstances that allow for human flourishing? And when women I have been in conversation with, you know, consider abortion at some points, if it's not a medical emergency, it's also about the ability to really be able to support the needs of a larger family. And what are the considerations of that? We have an incredibly individualistic society that can also put many people and communities at tremendous risk. So there's a broader kind of sense of questioning, I think, that needs to come into play there. And so it's a short essay. I'd invite you to read. I think it's very helpful because it really takes it out of that political framing.
Thank you. This next question might ask you to expand on what you're just starting to chat about. Can you help us consider possible perspectives on ethical Christian, this is a new phrase to me, anti-maternalism, choosing not to have children in light of such limited resources and environmental strain?
Yeah. This is a, you know, this is important because there is a kind of assumption, I think, that we have in Christian communities, and I'll place it in Christian community. And if I'm going with the wrong assumptions here, whoever phrased the question, come back, okay? We have an assumption in Christian community that the good family also incorporates women who embody this kind of sense of the good mother, the dutiful mother, and that somehow that is a passage to adulthood. It's also a passage to really beginning to affirm the fullness of womanhood. You know, this are historic, there's a lot of historic baggage there that comes out, at least in the southeastern United States, from what was known as the cult of white womanhood. I don't know if you've ever heard that term. And I think that for women, the questions are deeper, right? Just because we may be biologically identified as females, perhaps motherhood may not always be the fullness of our aptitude or the way in which we fully actualize our identities, who we are in society or even in the family. And I guess my hope is that Christian communities can welcome that more expansive understanding of what it means for women to fully actualize who they are. We have diverse talents and gifts. And so I think that it's not anti-maternalism, that perhaps this is a way of women trying to realize all of their vocation and capacities and celebrate those in society in a different way that may be counter to the way we thought about it in the past. Does that answer that question? Did I understand correctly? I don't know who asked it.
Thank you. I'm sure that Elizabeth Hinson-Hasty will be willing to linger around, so please do feel free to stay at the end of this hour to follow up on any of these questions if you'd like to. This next question is the PCA a result of this culture war? And I wonder if we might expand that question to just hear a little bit about some different you've briefly spoken about different denominational stances, but when we think particularly about the PCUSA and the PCA kind of approaching this topic and broader culture wars as well.
The PCA is Presbyterian Church in America. I can't speak specifically to that denomination, but I will say that schism, divisions between and within Presbyterian churches, Baptist churches, other denominations, yes, those are a result of the culture wars. I would definitely frame that as part of it. In the Presbyterian Church USA, our denomination also has lost congregations because of the debate over LGBTQIA rights, ordination, same-sex marriage. These aren't secrets. So it's just that specific denomination. I don't know. But it is a broader reflection of these competing visions of what Christianity is, whether or not we live in a Christian nation. Some ethicists who are engaging in conversation about reproductive justice, they'll also use this phrase that it's a battle for the soul of the nation, that the fact that we would have Roe v. Wade, it's not just a reflection of restricting women's rights, but it's a kind of reflection of moral degeneracy in our society. You'll find those arguments out there. For me, that's why I framed it in this broader culture war, that we do have these competing visions. And if we can see the broader vision, in my mind, I think that helps advocacy, because historically, advocacy focuses on a particular issue, all right, that can advance a particular cause. But are we seeing the broader picture of the competing claims and what that really means for not just specific policy, but what our country looks like in the future, what our churches look like in the future? So yes, I do think it probably is. I just don't know enough about that particular denomination.
Thank you. I have two more questions. So there will probably be space for one or two more beyond that. So hand that to Robin if you have one. The next question is: what are ways the local church can better care for the 1 in 4 women who have chosen an abortion?
I would say normalize the conversation. I mean, part of the discussion that you're having today and the opportunity to talk about reproductive justice is a big piece of that. Normalize that conversation and move out of, I used this language before from Rebecca Peters' work, the justification paradigm, where the framing of the conversation begins from the standpoint of whether or not uh, women can justly consider having abortion. You know, reframe that conversation and open up spaces for women to be able to talk about the questions that they have about pregnancy, childbearing, mothering, all of these interconnected experiences, uh, and affirm women for that. Allow them to drive that conversation.
Thank you. This is related to that, kind of in the vein of pastoral care related to this topic. Towards the end of your presentation, you mentioned ritualizing miscarriage. I wonder if you might share a few examples of how you've seen that done well and meaningfully at either the local level, community level, or even beyond that.
Mhm. I think I've seen this done the best really through friendships at this point, and I think it could be broadened to a more communal level. But for example, having opportunities to also care for the body through yoga practices. I have friends when they've had miscarriages that have gone together to yoga classes intentionally to be able to have that space to calm themselves and also just to reflect on their own feelings and then to go to coffee together and to talk about the kind of sense of loss, which for many people, miscarriage is simply not discussed. It's a private event, and it's seen for some women, it's seen as an embarrassing event. And I'll mention to you, I've had a miscarriage myself, and so that kind of affirmation of other women and the ability to talk about it was incredibly affirming. The chapter that I have in encountering this, the sacred, reflects on that experience. And what's been interesting to me is by talking about those kinds of experiences, which I was born in Louisville, Kentucky. I have this debate with my husband. He's from this area, whether or not that is the South. And see, he says it's not the South. For me, it was always Upper South. But I will say, in the culture of that area, it was easier for me to share some of those experiences. And I know there's a different challenge in different places, but to create spaces where women can name that they had the experience. And it also provides the opportunity for other women to share their stories. And what's been amazing to me, even after writing that chapter and naming the experience, is how many other women come up to me and say, I know I had the same experience. And so to tell the story becomes part of the ritual. And the story begins to share and affirm that we can't just erase that from our memory. It's also a part of our larger lives.
Thank you. Are there any other questions this morning? I have one more I can pull out if I need to. All right, well, I'll ask an additional question. You obviously work with a lot of folks who are hoping to enter into ministry, are already in ministry. How do you see this conversation being addressed and held across our seminaries when we think about the future leaders of the church, future advocates, future folks who will work for the PCUSA? Where is this conversation coming up, and is it? What does that look like in your in the world of education?
Mhm. I think that in the seminaries, we need to expect more of conversations related to gender and sexuality, and also to women's leadership, and to remember also the history of women's conversations and ministries that have so much informed Christian community that can be neglected. And I think that churches also can do a lot to expect that of their ministers, because a lot of what happens in a seminary community has to do with what congregations hope their leadership will engender when they are serving you in different places. And so don't be afraid to expect your ministers also to bring these dialogues into the congregation and to be imaginative about the kind of rituals that can really create transformation, not just in the church, but also in our broader society. And so, one of the reasons for many years I've worked on the congregational level is to help build that bridge between the church and the academy, so that transformation can come. And it's really a partnership, because the seminary, we have opportunity for 3 or 4 years to give a kind of scaffolding, but it also comes from the expectation that congregations will have, that you can have rich dialogue around reproductive justice, or the culture war, or competing visions for our society. And think about the relevance of that for what each of you are going to do in your own vocations, because that partnership is actually what's going to make the change occur.
Thank you. Any other questions this morning? Yes, Grady, let me get you in the microphone since we've got folks on Zoom.
With the number of women who are going into ministry these days, and I believe, if I'm not mistaken, there are actually more women pursuing this call than men at the present moment. As they move through the process and begin to entertain calls into the ministry, are search committees asking women where they stand on reproductive rights as a way of calling out those whose theology, sense of ethics is not embraced by the church? Is it being used, I don't want to call it in a weaponizing way, but as a way of just separating those who are acceptable and those who are not? If that's, do you get my drift with the question? Okay, thank you.
Yeah. This is a tough question. It is, because I want to say to you that I wouldn't want to suggest that there ought to be any political or theological litmus test for who can serve in a particular pulpit. At the same time, I also think that congregations and denominations have identities. And one of the things that I appreciate very much about the PCUSA is this long tradition of advocacy for reproductive justice, and the work of the advocacy committees. And so, how do we hold that tension? I don't know that the tension needs to be held by a particular search committee. I do think it needs to be held by the educational process. And I do think it needs to be held by considering, the kind of sense of the identity also of our nation. One of the reasons that I highlighted this history that has been so well articulated, I think, by organizations like Planned Parenthood, is that this is a shift also in the trajectory of our nation. And I think for Presbyterians, we have a deep kind of sense of concern over that. And so I think there has to be a richer kind of way of inviting that. But I wouldn't suggest a kind of theological or political kind of litmus test. That would worry me. I want to maintain the space for dialogue. I do.
The search committee who are interviewing candidates.
Yeah. They'll ask the question. Yeah. Has that happened? I don't know. Yeah.
I would guess that women are. I don't know of any instances, but I would be surprised if
Yeah. 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 That's interesting. Yeah. Thank you for that.
Thank you. Robin, did you have one more? All right, this will be our last question this morning. Let me hand you the mic.
So I'm going to step away, I guess, a little bit from more the corporate ethics perspective and ask more of a on an individual basis question. I think there's a notion of shame and grace that we individually potentially apply in an unequitable, that might not be the right word, basis to men and to women. And I want to put two different scenarios out there and perhaps ask you to challenge our individual thinking and how we look at others. One is from a dear friend of my own generation who in college ended up having an abortion. Was in a relationship that has been her long-term relationship and has gone on to have multiple children. That was a very, very, very difficult decision for her. There was much shame around even being in that position. But she has gone on to claim a good and happy life, as has her whole family. But should that have been known, the community would have looked on her completely differently than they look on her today, had that been something that was out there. In the generation of women after me, I have watched a young woman that I have known since she was 12 go on and make a decision because she so definitively did not want to have children and was so worried about the direction this country was heading that she opted to have her fallopian tubes removed in her early 20s. And that has also brought from the family of the person that she like there is a judgment aspect of some of these decisions that I'm trying to not be extreme in my comments, but very differently seems to apply to the female side of the equation than it does to the male side of the equation. And I would appreciate you, maybe it's not a definitive answer, it's more the questions we should ask ourselves as we think as Christians about where grace lives and breathes. If we are executing judgment personally on others in this space, are we off a little bit in our thinking? Anyway, thank you.
Thank you for that, because that's a really important question. And I want to come back to this idea of the Christian good family. And, you know, when I say that, we often have an imagination of what that is plays out in congregational settings from when we're children. You know, the kind of expectation that our children will grow up, they'll get married, they'll have children, they will, you know, be productive citizens in community, and imagining those kind of hopes and dreams that when they're don't play out exactly with those expectations, there isn't an alternative story in Christian community that would provide that sense of grace, I think, that you're mentioning. So I want to encourage congregations to share alternative narratives of family and also think about hope in different ways. Because a lot for parents, I think, when maybe a child would make a choice of removing their fallopian tubes, is that there was a kind of hope and dream perhaps of grandchildren, of continued family, of the pictures of family celebrations at the beach and in different places that really embody a sense of wholeness and community that is also affirming of one's own kind of expectations and goodness. And don't hear me saying that some of those images are bad or that the kind of sense of family and connection is a negative thing, but I want to say there's much more to that story. And there are many more ways of living that out and embodying that, and that people make choices for different reasons. So I think part of the grace is to allow that alternative understanding, those different narratives of family, to enter into Christian community and celebrate it also in Christian ritual. And, you know, when we just celebrated Christmas, right? What other stories of family could also be included in the manger scene? How could we depict that within congregational settings so that the hope and the expectation is also embodied very much in different ways? And I think that could challenge and change the kind of sense of grace and shame paradigm that you mentioned. It could be in liturgies in terms of, you know, creating litanies of affirmation of the goodness of very many different ways of living out the fullness of our vocations and actualizing, you know, fully who we are and who we're called to be. There are a variety of ways to do that, not just the image of a kind of patriarchal family or traditional family, and welcome that into our communities. So, I mean, that's what I would suggest, is to help, and it filters through, right, into parent expectations, family expectations. Yeah.
Would you all please join me in thanking Dr. Hinson-Hasty?
Thank you.
We are so grateful for your time, your expertise, your openness, and willingness to be with us this morning. And thank you all for being with us as well. Let me close us with a word of prayer. Holy God, thank you for this time together. That we never outgrow our ability to learn is one of the greatest gifts you've given us. And we thank you for the ways we were able to do so today. May the learning, the questions, the agitations, and the resonances we've experienced today shape us and equip us as we continue along the journey of faith. Amen.
Amen.
I hope you will each feel encouraged to stay for worship, either at 11 o'clock over in the sanctuary or here in the fellowship hall for our family service. Friends, go in peace.